June 4th, 1942. Somewhere over the Pacific, a Japanese Zero pilot locks onto an American dive bomber. Easy kill. These things are slow, clumsy, flying coffins. He lines up his shot, pulls the trigger, and misses. He comes around again, fires again, misses again. The bomber's rear gunner swings his weapon around and shoots the Zero out of the sky. Then another Zero attacks. Same result. Shot down. Then a third. Shot down. 3 of Japan's elite fighter pilots dead. Killed by a slow bomber they should have destroyed in seconds. And then, that same bomber dove on a Japanese aircraft carrier and sent it to the bottom of the Pacific. This is the story of how the worst plane in the sky became the most deadly weapon of World War II. Let's break it down. Before we get into the battle itself, you need to understand something about the Pacific War in 1942. America was losing, badly. 6 months earlier, the Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor and destroyed most of the American Pacific Fleet. In the weeks that followed, Japan had conquered the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, Burma, and dozens of Pacific islands. They had created an empire stretching from the borders of India to the shores of Australia. The speed of their conquest shocked the world. Military experts had predicted it would take Japan years to achieve what they accomplished in months. The British surrendered Singapore, their greatest Pacific fortress, in just 7 days. The American garrison in the Philippines held out for months, but eventually fell too. General Douglas MacArthur had to flee by boat in the middle of the night. Japan seemed invincible, and at the heart of their invincibility was one weapon, the Mitsubishi A6M0. The Zero was a legend. It was faster than any Allied fighter, more maneuverable than anything the Americans, British, or Dutch could put in the air. Its pilots were trained for years before seeing combat. Some had been flying since the 1930s, with experience from the war in China. When a Zero appeared in the sky, Allied pilots learned to run. Not fight, run. The kill ratios were obscene. In the early months of the war, Zeros were shooting down Allied aircraft at rates of 10-1, sometimes 20-1. American pilots who survived encounters with Zeros described them as supernatural. The planes could turn on a dime, climb like rockets, and stay in the air for incredible distances. One pilot said fighting a Zero was like fighting a hummingbird with a sledgehammer. You couldn't hit them. You couldn't escape them. You could only die. Against this backdrop of Japanese dominance, America was scrambling to find any advantage. Their best fighters, the P-40 Warhawk, the F-4F Wildcat, were slower than the Zero, less maneuverable, and often outclassed. The Navy was desperately trying to rebuild after Pearl Harbor, with only 3 aircraft carriers left operational in the Pacific. And on the decks of those carriers sat a plane that nobody expected to become a legend, the Douglas SBD Dauntless. Let me tell you about the Dauntless, because understanding this aircraft is key to understanding everything that happened next. The SBD Dauntless was a dive bomber. Its job was simple: fly over an enemy ship, tip its nose straight down toward the ocean, plunge at a near vertical angle, release a bomb at the last possible second, and pull out before hitting the water. That's it. It wasn't designed to dogfight. It wasn't designed to outrun fighters. It was designed to deliver a single bomb with pinpoint accuracy. Everything about the aircraft reflected this purpose. It was slow, maximum speed of about 245 miles per hour. Compare that to the Zero's 330 miles per hour, and you see the problem immediately. In a straight chase, a Zero would catch a Dauntless in minutes. It was also heavy, loaded with a 1,000-pound bomb. The Dauntless became a flying brick. It climbed slowly. It turned slowly. It accelerated slowly. American pilots joked that SBD stood for slow but deadly. The deadly part was a hope. The slow part was a certainty. But the Dauntless had something the Zero didn't. It had a rear gunner. Behind the pilot sat a second crewman with a twin .30 caliber machine gun mounted on a flexible ring. He could swing this weapon around and fire at any pursuing aircraft. It wasn't much. .30 caliber was a relatively small round, and the gunner had limited ammunition. But it was something. The Dauntless also had something else. It was built like a tank. The Zero was light and maneuverable because the Japanese had stripped it of every unnecessary ounce of weight. That included armor. That included self-sealing fuel tanks. If you hit a Zero with anything significant, it would burn. The Dauntless was the opposite. It had armor plating around the pilot and rear gunner. Its fuel tanks were self-sealing if a bullet punctured them. The rubber lining would expand and close the hole. It could take punishment that would destroy 3 Zeros. American pilots discovered this the hard way. They would come back from missions with dozens of bullet holes in their aircraft, damage that should have killed them, and walk away unharmed. The Dauntless absorbed bullets like a sponge absorbs water. It just kept flying. But here's the thing about dive bombers. They usually need fighter escorts. They're too slow and too vulnerable to survive on their own against enemy fighters. That was the doctrine. That was the expectation. At Midway, everything went wrong. And somehow that made everything go right. Let's set the stage for the Battle of Midway, because this is where our story really begins. By June 1942, the Japanese were planning their next major operation. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the mastermind behind Pearl Harbor, wanted to draw the American fleet into a decisive battle and destroy it. His target was Midway Atoll, a tiny pair of islands about 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii. Midway was strategically vital. If Japan captured it, they could threaten Hawaii itself. More importantly, Yamamoto believed the Americans would have to fight to defend it, and in that fight, he would destroy their remaining carriers. He assembled the most powerful naval force in Pacific history. For fleet carriers, 2 light carriers, 11 battleships, 16 cruisers, and dozens of destroyers and support ships. Over 200 aircraft, the cream of the Japanese Navy. Against this armada, the Americans had 3 carriers: Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, hastily repaired after being badly damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea. They had no battleships, fewer cruisers, fewer destroyers. About 230 aircraft in total, many of them outdated. On paper, it was a mismatch. Japan should have won. Japan expected to win. They had broken American codes and knew the attack was coming, or so they thought. What they didn't know was that American codebreakers had actually broken Japanese codes, and the Americans knew exactly where the Japanese fleet would be and when it would arrive. The trap was set, but knowing where the enemy would be was only half the battle. The Americans still had to find them, attack them, and sink them before being destroyed themselves. And on the morning of June 4th, 1942, everything that could go wrong did go wrong. The first American strikes were disasters. Torpedo bombers from all 3 carriers launched attacks on the Japanese fleet. These were TBD Devastator's slow, obsolete aircraft that had to fly low and straight to release their torpedoes. The Zeros slaughtered them. Of the 41 Devastators that attacked, 35 were shot down. Entire squadrons were wiped out in minutes. One squadron, Torpedo 8 from the Hornet, lost all 15 aircraft and all but 1 crewman. Ensign George Gay survived by hiding under a floating seat cushion, watching the battle unfold around him. The Japanese anti-aircraft guns and Zero fighters created a wall of death that the torpedo bombers couldn't penetrate. Not a single torpedo hit. 0 American damage to the Japanese carriers. Meanwhile, the Japanese were preparing their own counterstrike. Their carriers had aircraft on deck, being armed and fueled for an attack on the American fleet. The Japanese knew the American carriers were out there somewhere. They just had to launch their strike first. And then the Dauntless arrived. Here's what happened and why it was so insane. The dive bomber squadrons from Enterprise and Yorktown had been searching for the Japanese fleet all morning. They had limited fuel. Some squadrons had already turned back. Others were hopelessly lost. The coordinated attack that American commanders had planned had completely fallen apart. When Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading the Enterprise dive bombers, finally spotted the Japanese fleet, he was almost out of fuel. He had 33 SBD Dauntless behind him. No fight de escort. The Wildcats that were supposed to protect them had gotten separated during the search, to go black entirely. Meanwhile, the ship below is firing everything it has at you. And if you've done everything right, if your angle was correct, your speed was correct, Your release point was corrector bomb hits. A 1,000-pound bomb is devastating to a ship. It doesn't just damage, it destroys. It penetrates the deck, explodes inside the ship, starts fires, detonates ammunition, kills hundreds of sailors in seconds. One bomb can sink a ship. At Midway, the Dauntless didn't land one bomb. They landed dozens. The first carrier to be hit was Kaga. Bombs tore through her flight deck, exploding among the aircraft that were being armed and fueled. Those aircraft became bombs themselves, their fuel and ammunition cooking off in a chain reaction of destruction. Within minutes, Kaga was an inferno. The second carrier, Akagi Yamamoto's flagship, was hit next. A single bomb would have been bad enough. Multiple bombs turned her into a floating crematorium. Aircraft exploded on deck. Fire spread below. The proud carrier that had led the attack on Pearl Harbor was dying. The third carrier, Soryu, received the same treatment. Bombs from Yorktown's dive bombers found her at almost exactly the same moment Enterprise's planes hit the other two. 3 carriers burning simultaneously within a span of about 5 minutes. The Japanese fleet, the most powerful naval force in the Pacific, had just lost 3/4 of its carrier strength in the time it takes to make a cup of coffee. And the Dauntless pilots? Most of them made it back. They had dove through anti-aircraft fire that should have killed them. They had attacked without fighter escort against the most experienced carrier force in the world. And they had won. But we're not done. Remember that 4th carrier? Hiryu was the only one that escaped the initial attack. And Hiryu struck back. Her aircraft launched a counterstrike against the American fleet and found Yorktown. Japanese dive bombers and torpedo bombers attacked in waves, hitting the American carrier with multiple bombs and torpedoes. Yorktown was badly damaged, listing, and would eventually sink days later. But before she was hit, something remarkable happened that shows you exactly what the Dauntless could do. When the Japanese aircraft came to attack Yorktown, they were intercepted by American fighters and anti-aircraft fire. But in the chaos of the battle, some Japanese planes got through, and some American Dauntless were still in the air, returning from their attack on the Japanese carriers. What happened next is the story I teased at the beginning. A rear gunner on one of these returning Dauntless, some accounts attribute this to aviation radioman 3rd Class Harold Lisk. Though records are sometimes incomplete, found himself in the impossible situation of being attacked by Zeros while flying a slow, cumbersome dive bomber. 3 Zeros lined up to shoot him down. One by one, they made attack runs on his aircraft. One by one, the rear gunner tracked them with his twin .30 caliber machine guns and opened fire. The first Zero took hits in the engine. It caught fire and spun into the sea. The second Zero came in from a different angle, trying to attack from the gunner's blind spot. The gunner swung his weapon around and poured fire into the fighter. It exploded. The third Zero pilot must have seen what happened to his wingman. He should have broken off. He attacked anyway and met the same fate. 3 Zeros, 3 kills, from a rear gunner in a slow dive bomber. How is this possible? How does a single guy with a machine gun shoot down 3 of the most deadly fighters in the world? The answer comes down to several factors, and understanding them tells you everything about why the Dauntless was so successful throughout the Pacific War. First, the Zero's weakness. Remember how I said the Japanese stripped the Zero of weight to make it faster and more maneuverable? That meant no armor. A pilot sitting in a Zero was protected by nothing but his seat and the thin aluminum skin of the aircraft. A .30 caliber bullet, a relatively small round, could penetrate that skin easily. Hit the pilot, and the plane goes down. Hit the engine, and the plane goes down. Hit the fuel tank, and the plane becomes a fireball. The Zero was a glass cannon. It could dish out incredible damage, but it couldn't take any in return. American aircraft, including the Dauntless, were built on the opposite philosophy. Survive first, perform second. The Dauntless could absorb dozens of hits and keep flying. The Zero might not survive one well-placed bullet. Second, ammunition and range. The Zero's cannons were powerful, but had limited ammunition. Japanese pilots had to be selective about when they fired. The Dauntless rear gunner, on the other hand, had belt-fed machine guns with relatively generous ammunition supplies. He could fire sustained bursts, filling the sky with bullets. A Zero attacking from the rear had to fly through that wall of lead. Third, angle of attack. When a fighter attacks a bomber from behind, both grasp without them. At Midway alone, Dauntless sank 4 fleet carriers. These weren't just any carriers, they were Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the most experienced carrier force in the world, with the most skilled pilots, the best aircraft, and the most veteran crews. Losing them was a blow that Japan never recovered from. They also damaged or sank multiple other ships throughout the battle. The damage was so severe that Japan had to cancel its offensive operations and go on the defensive for the first time in the war. And the losses among the Dauntless squadrons? Remarkably light, given what they accomplished. They lost aircraft, yes. Brave men died. But the casualty rate was nowhere near what the torpedo bombers suffered. The Dauntless pilots had proven that their aircraft, flown correctly and with a little bit of luck, could survive in the most hostile environment imaginable. But Midway wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Over the next 2 years, the Dauntless would prove itself again and again. At the Battle of the Coral Sea, Dauntless had already helped sink the light carrier Shoho and damage the fleet carrier Shokaku. At the Battle of the Eastern Solomons in August 1942, Dauntless sank the carrier Ryujo. At the Battle of Santa Cruz in October 1942, they damaged multiple Japanese carriers. At the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal in November 1942, Dauntless helped sink the battleship Hai, a 36,000-ton monster that was supposed to be invulnerable to air attack. The total tonnage sunk by SBD Dauntless during the war was staggering, more than any other aircraft type in the Pacific. And all of this came from a plane that was, by almost every measure, inferior to its Japanese counterparts in speed, climb rate, and maneuverability. So why did the Dauntless succeed where better aircraft failed? This is where we get into the really interesting stuff, the tactics, physics, and psychology that made the difference. Let's start with dive bombing itself. This was an incredibly difficult form of attack that required precision, courage, and a very specific kind of aircraft. Here's the problem with attacking a ship from the air. Ships are moving targets. A bomber flying level at high altitude, which is the safest way to attack, has to drop its bombs long before they reach the target. The bombs fall in an arc, taking many seconds to reach the water. In those seconds, a ship can turn, accelerate, slow down, or otherwise maneuver to avoid the bombs. Level bombing against ships was notoriously inaccurate. During the war, the hit rate for high-altitude level bombing against maneuvering ships was something like 1 to 3%. For every 100 bombs dropped, maybe 1 or 2 would hit. Dive bombing changed that equation entirely. When you dive at a target, you're essentially pointing a gun at it. Your bomb doesn't have to arc through the sky over a long distance. You release it close to the target, and it continues on almost the same trajectory you were flying. It's like the difference between throwing a baseball from the outfield and throwing it from 10 feet away. Hit rates for dive bombing were 20 to 25% or higher. Some exceptionally skilled pilots achieved 50% or better. That's 10 to 20 times more accurate than level bombing. But dive bombing required a special kind of aircraft. It needed to be strong enough to survive the stresses of a near-vertical dive and the violent pullout at the bottom. It needed dive brakes, surfaces that extended from the wings to slow the aircraft's descent and give the pilot time to aim. It needed good forward visibility so the pilot could see his target. And it needed to be stable and predictable in a dive, not prone to sudden rolls or yaws that would throw off the pilot's aim. The SBD Dauntless had all of these qualities. Its dive brakes, perforated metal flaps that extended from the trailing edges of the wing, slowed its descent to about 250 knots. Its sturdy construction could handle the G-forces of a 6,000-foot dive and recovery. Its cockpit gave the pilot excellent visibility, and it was rock-stable in a dive, going exactly where you pointed it. These qualities made it deadly against ships. But there was another advantage that nobody had anticipated. Its slowness made it harder to shoot down than anyone expected. Here's why. Anti-aircraft gunners on ships were trained to track fast-moving targets and calculate lead angles. They would aim ahead of an aircraft, filling the space it was flying into with shells. The faster the aircraft, the more predictable this calculation became. A plane traveling at 300 miles per hour would be in a predictable location in 2 seconds. But the Dauntless was slow. In its diving approach, with dive brakes extended, it was even slower. This actually threw off the aim of anti-aircraft gunners who were used to faster targets. They would calculate their lead based on expected speed, fire, and the aircraft. The more predictable this calculation became, a plane traveling at 300 miles per hour would be in a predictable location in 2 seconds. But the Dauntless was slow. In its diving approach, with dive brakes extended, it was even slower. This actually threw off the aim of anti-aircraft gunners who were used to faster targets. They would calculate their lead based on expected speed, fire, and the shells would explode ahead of the aircraft, which hadn't traveled as far as expected. The same principle applied to fighters. Zero pilots were trained to attack fast, maneuverable targets. Their tactics and instincts were calibrated for aircraft that behaved in certain ways. The Dauntless behaved differently. Its slow speed and heavy construction made it less responsive to controls, which sounds like a disadvantage, but it also made its movements less erratic. A fighter attacking a Dauntless had to slow down to avoid overshooting, which made the fighter vulnerable. And if the fighter slowed down too much, it became an easier target for the rear gunner. It was a deadly dance. The Zero was faster and more maneuverable, but those advantages worked against it in a pursuit situation. The Dauntless pilot could make small, deliberate movements that kept the rear gunner's field of fire aligned with the attacker. The Zero pilot had to work hard just to stay in position for a shot, and every second he spent doing that was a second the rear gunner was firing at him. There's also the human factor. Zero pilots were trained to be aggressive, to close quickly and destroy the enemy with their superior firepower. This served them well against most opponents. But against a Dauntless, aggression was suicide. The proper tactic would have been to make slashing attacks from oblique angles, firing short bursts, and breaking away before the rear gunner could track them. But this was less satisfying, less certain, and contrary to their training. Many Zero pilots attacked Dauntless the same way they attacked everything else and died for it. This brings us to an important point about the air war in the Pacific. Skill and courage weren't always enough. The Japanese had incredibly skilled pilots. Their training programs were among the best in the world. But they also had fatal flaws. Notably, they had no system for rotating experienced pilots home to train new ones. As their veterans died, they were replaced by less and less capable replacements. The Americans had the opposite approach. They rotated their best pilots home after a certain number of missions, using them to train the next generation. As the war progressed, American pilot quality went up while Japanese pilot quality went down. By 1944, the gap was enormous. But even in 1942, when Japanese pilots were at their peak, the Dauntless showed that pilot skill wasn't everything. A well-designed aircraft, flown with courage and tactical intelligence, could overcome numerical and qualitative disadvantages. Let's talk about the specific individuals who made this happen, because history too often forgets the names while remembering the machines. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, who led the Enterprise dive bombers at Midway, made one of the most consequential decisions of the entire war. When he didn't find the Japanese fleet where he expected, he had to choose: turn back and save his fuel, or continue searching and risk running out of gas over the open ocean. He continued searching. He found a Japanese fleet, and his decision to press on, despite the fuel situation, led directly to the sinking of 3 carriers. McCluskey himself was wounded in the attack shot through the shoulder and arm by anti-aircraft fire, but he kept flying, kept leading his squadron, and made it back to Enterprise. He landed his bullet-riddled Dauntless with wounds that Battle of Midway actually meant for the war, because the tactical victory was just the beginning. Before Midway, Japan was on the offensive. They were choosing where and when to fight. They were expanding their empire. They had the initiative. After Midway, everything changed. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, about 40% of their total carrier strength. They lost over 200 aircraft. And most critically, they lost hundreds of experienced aircrews pilots, navigators, bombardiers, radio men who could not be easily replaced. Japan's pilot training system was designed to produce small numbers of elite aviators, not large numbers of adequate ones. When those elite aviators died at Midway, there was no pipeline of replacements ready to take their place. The pilots who replaced them were less experienced, less skilled, and more likely to die in combat, which meant they couldn't pass on their knowledge to the next generation. It was a death spiral that Japan never escaped. The Americans, by contrast, could replace their losses. Their industrial capacity was ramping up. New carriers were under construction. New aircraft were coming off assembly lines. New pilots were graduating from training programs. The balance of power in the Pacific shifted at Midway, and it never shifted back. Within 2 years, the Japanese Navy would be a shadow of its former self, hunted across the Pacific by American carrier task forces that were larger and more powerful than anything Japan could assemble. And at the heart of those task forces, right up until 1944, were SBD Dauntless. The aircraft remained in frontline service longer than anyone expected because it just kept working. Newer dive bombers, the SB-2C Helldiver, for example, were faster and carried more bombs, but they were also more complex, more prone to mechanical problems, and less loved by their crews. Pilots who flew both aircraft almost universally preferred the Dauntless. It did what you told it to do. It brought you home. It might not have been glamorous, but it was reliable. And in combat, reliability is everything. Let's talk about some of the other famous engagements where the Dauntless proved its worth, because Midway wasn't the only place where this slow bomber humiliated its critics. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, sometimes called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, Dauntless participated in one of the most lopsided aerial victories in history. By this point in the war, Japanese pilot quality had declined dramatically, while American pilots were better trained and flying better aircraft. American fighters shot down over 300 Japanese aircraft in a single day, losing only about 30 of their own. But the Dauntless also contributed. They attacked the Japanese fleet as it retreated, sinking the carrier Hyo and damaging several other ships. The attack was launched at extreme range, late in the day, and many aircraft ran out of fuel on the return flight. In one of the most dramatic episodes of the Pacific War, Admiral Mark Mitcher ordered his carriers to turn on their lights, violating all blackout protocols and making the fleet visible to enemy submarines so that his returning pilots could find their way home. Even so, many aircraft ditched in the darkness. But the rescue efforts were extensive, and most of the aircrews were recovered. The Dauntless was finally retired from frontline carrier service later that year, replaced by the Helldiver. But it continued to serve in other roles with Marine squadrons, with smaller escort carriers, and with training units until the end of the war. And even after the war, some Dauntless served with foreign air forces. The French used them in Indochina in the late 1940s. Some survived long enough to become museum pieces. The final tally for the SBD Dauntless is remarkable. It destroyed more Japanese shipping than any other Allied aircraft. It participated in every major carrier battle of the Pacific War. It shot down 138 Japanese aircraft, which is extraordinary for a dive bomber. Fighters are supposed to shoot down other planes. Bombers are supposed to attack surface targets. The Dauntless did both, and it did it all while being officially obsolete from almost the moment it entered service. Newer, faster, more modern aircraft were always supposedly just around the corner. But the Dauntless kept flying, kept fighting, and kept winning. So what are the lessons here? What does the story of the Dauntless tell us about war, technology, and human nature? First, specifications aren't everything. The Zero was faster. The Zero was more maneuverable. On paper, the Zero was the superior aircraft. But paper doesn't account for armor, survivability, pilot training, tactical doctrine, or the specific circumstances of combat. The Dauntless was worse by almost every measure that mattered to engineers and procurement officers. It was better in the ways that mattered in combat. Second, simplicity and reliability beat complexity and performance. The Dauntless was a straightforward aircraft with few complicated systems. This made it easier to maintain, easier to repair, and less prone to breakdowns at critical moments. More sophisticated aircraft often spent more time being fixed than being flown. Third, survival matters more than dominance. The Dauntless couldn't outfight a Zero in a dogfight. It wasn't designed to, but it could survive a Zero attack long enough to complete its mission and come home. In the long run of a war, bringing your aircraft and pilots home means you can fly again tomorrow. Losing aircraft and pilots, even if you're winning the individual engagements, means you eventually run out of both. Fourth, tactical surprise can overcome technical inferiority. At Midway, the Dauntless caught the Japanese fleet at exactly the wrong moment with their fighters at low altitude. Their decks covered with armed and fueled aircraft, their attention focused on the dying torpedo bombers. Timing and luck played a role, but so did the sacrifice of the torpedo squadrons that pulled the Zeros down. Victory often comes from unexpected directions. Fifth, courage is not the absence of fear. The men who flew Dauntless at Midway were terrified. They knew the odds. They had seen what happened to the torpedo bombers. They attacked anyway. They dove into anti-aircraft fire that was trying to kill them, released their bombs at the last possible second, and flew home through skies filled with enemies. That's not fearlessness. That's doing your job, despite the fear. That's what wins wars. There's one more aspect of this story that deserves attention: the role of intelligence and preparation. The Americans didn't win at Midway just because of brave pilots and good aircraft. They won because they knew the Japanese were coming. American codebreakers, working in a basement in Hawaii, had cracked the Japanese naval codes. They knew the target was Midway. They knew the approximate date of the attack. They knew the composition of the Japanese fleet. This intelligence allowed Admiral Chester Nimitz to position his 3 carriers in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. It allowed him to set an ambush instead of being ambushed. It turned a potential disaster into a decisive victory. Without that intelligence, the Dauntless might never have found the Japanese fleet. Without that intelligence, the Japanese might have caught the American carriers by surprise and sunk them instead. The bravery of the pilots mattered. The quality of the aircraft mattered. But information mattered just as much. This is a lesson that applies far beyond World War II. In any competitive situation, war, business, sports, life, knowing what the other side is planning gives you an enormous advantage. The side that has better information usually wins, even if they have worse equipment or fewer resources. The Japanese at Midway had better ships, better planes, better trained pilots, and more of everything. They lost because they didn't know they were sailing into a trap. Now let's bring this full circle to our opening image. That rear gunner in his slow dive bomber, shooting down 3 Zeros that should have killed him easily. What does this story tell us? It tells us that statistics and probabilities describe what usually happens, not what always happens. Usually, a Zero should beat a Dauntless. Usually, a fighter should destroy a bomber. But war is chaotic. Combat is unpredictable. Individual skill, determination, and luck can overcome overwhelming odds. That gunner wasn't supposed to win, but he did. He hit his targets. He protected his pilot. He made a home. And somewhere in the wreckage at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean lie 3 Zero fighters whose pilots learned too late that the slow, clumsy American dive bomber was more dangerous than it looked. There's something beautiful about that, isn't there? The underdog.